Lashana Tova. As many of you know, I grew up in Spring, Texas, a suburb of Northwest Houston. Spring is many things, but the bastion of Jewish life, it is not. We were part of a minuscule part of the population and very spread out. My father, now a retired rabbi, liked to say that he served a community that was roughly half the size of Rhode Island. To show how small the Jewish population was, I went to a high school of nearly 3,000 students, of which 2 of us were Jewish. Thus, one of the biggest arguments I had every year was getting the teachers, and especially my band director, to understand why I would be missing classes and rehearsals for the High Holy Days. Thankfully, that was for the most part the extent of the challenges I faced in spring as a Jew. Part of the reason for this was because I grew up in the 80s. As Sarah Hurwitz writes in her book, As a Jew, Reclaiming Our Story from Those Who Blame, Shame, and Try to Erase Us, quote, I consider myself one of the luckiest Jews in history to have come of age in the 1980s and 1990s at the height of this golden age for American Jews. As she notes, when I applied to college, there were no Jewish quotas. As an undergraduate and then a law student, I never once felt unwelcome because of any aspect of my Jewish identity. Like what Hurwitz described, I felt the same way for the most part. But because I grew up in the buckle of the Bible Belt, there were instances where nonetheless I felt like I stood out, even if I never felt the full weight of being part of such a small minority. However, as I think back on my time in high school, there was an experience that ultimately had a profound effect on me. This one took place during an honors literature class where we would have very Aristotelian conversations. In this particular class, though my memories are a little hazy, we somehow got into the conversation about which is harder in today's world, back in the early 90s, to be black or to be Jewish. The answer the class came up with after much discussion is that it is harder to be black. Why? Because one does not have to publicly present their Jewishness. I was troubled by this conversation, but it has taken me years, decades to understand why. First of all, no one wins when we get into the persecution Olympics. But secondly, I've only recently begun to appreciate that many of my classmates in that moment looked at me as if to say being Jewish is simply a religion, something that I chose to do and be, just like they chose to be Christian. Whereas someone who is African American has no choice in the matter. People see them first and foremost because of the color of their skin, and that has and continues to define their lived experience. Now, they were right to some extent. I will never know what it means to be viewed because of my skin color, and I certainly am not saying anything to diminish the experiences of people of color. But when it came to what they had to say about the lived Jewish experience, about my lived Jewish experience, it was only through years of study and reflection that I began to realize just how wrong, and in some ways, how anti-Semitic their perspectives were. I don't blame my classmates. They were just looking at it through the lens of their own lived experience. But what bothered me then and continues to bother me now is that I let them define my Judaism for me and thereby influence how I thought about it for years afterwards. But as I am learning, I am not the only one. As Sarah Hurwitz writes, as I studied the Jewish past and lived in the Jewish present, I began to see just how infiltrated and warped my Jewish identity has been by hatred and lies, by attempts, sometimes well-intentioned, sometimes not, by others to jam my people into categories like race, ethnicity, and religion in which we do not fit, by the language of the Christian majority culture in which I had been raised, one filled with words and conceptions that had not only failed to accommodate Judaism's truths, but to distort them and demean them. When reading through Sarah's words and thinking about my experiences, I am forced to confront the reality of how much of my own Jewish journey was both impacted and shaped by those who have very little knowledge or understanding of Judaism. Equally so, I am also embracing the new reality that it is time to reclaim our heritage and not let others define it for us. In order to do this, though, we have to also have an honest conversation about anti-Semitism and the way it has impacted us both externally and also internally. As Dara Horn writes in her book, People Love Dead Jews, two distinct patterns of anti-Semitism can be identified by the Jewish holidays that celebrate triumphs over them, Purim and Hanukkah. In the Purim version of anti-Semitism, exemplified by the Persian genocidal decrees in the biblical book of Esther, the goal is openly stated and unambiguous: kill all the Jews. In the Hanukkah version of anti-Semitism, whose appearances range from the Spanish Inquisition to the Soviet regime, the goal is still to eliminate Jewish civilization. But in the Hanukkah version, this goal could theoretically be accomplished by destroying Jewish civilization while leaving the warm, de-Jewed bodies of its former practitioners intact. For this reason, the Hanukkah version of anti-Semitism often employs Jews as its agents. It requires not dead Jews, but cool Jews, those willing to give up whatever specific aspect of Jewish civilization is currently uncool. The second motif, this Hanukkah version, is where we get the notion of, you can join my social justice cause only if you renounce X. It is the argument that one has to renounce or denounce an element of their Jewishness in order to be socially acceptable. For some, this has meant being told they are only welcome if they denounce or renounce their love of Israel. No one of Russian origin or from China or even North Korea is told to do such a thing. But it is acceptable to demand this of Jews. Why? Well, because in the eyes of many, Jews are in a position of privilege and power. Sadly, both versions of anti-Semitism have risen drastically and dramatically over the past few years, symbolizing an end to our aforementioned golden age here in the United States, well before the tragic events of October 7, 2023. For example, it was Purim anti-Semitism is what inspired the tragic murders that took place at the Tree of Life Synagogue on October 27, 2018, where a deranged gunman killed 11 people whose only sin was gathering together to pray on a Shabbat morning. This killer was motivated by a long line of Jew hatred dating back to Roman times. This ancient hatred has morphed and evolved in seemingly contradictory ways. But it has always been there. As Hurwitz notes, there's an endless variation on the same three themes: power, depravity, and conspiracy. These same false claims about Jews over and over again, claims that Jews are overwhelmingly, disproportionately, and preternaturally powerful, claims that Jews are diabolically depraved, evil, perverted, greedy, dishonest. Whatever the good thing is, Jews are against it. They are never to be trusted. Claims that Jews are in a conspiracy. They're working together behind the scenes so no one knows about it, to enrich and empower themselves at the expense of everyone else. How else can so few Jews be so powerful? In the case of the Tree of Life, like the protests in Charlottesville, it was because of the belief that Jews are using their supernal powers to replace whites with people of color. But what is so disheartening is how so many sides and factions have come to agree on so many of these tropes. For the longest time during our golden age, we could rest assured relatively that these were the views of groups like right-wing Christian nationalists. But sadly, they have also seeped into groups on the left, making what some have referred to as a horseshoe of hate. And what is old is new again. Nowadays, it is common to hear the Hanukkah anti-Semitic trope when someone shouts, "Go back to Europe," which is both different and the same as a century ago. At the turn of the 20th century, Jews were now considered a distinctive race depicted in cartoons with massive hooked noses, large lips, fat stomachs, and dark hair and skin. As historian Magda Teeter explains, Jews were seen as Oriental, foreigners, despite having resided in Europe for many centuries. By the late 19th century, Europeans had taken to insisting Jews should go back to Palestine. Go back to Palestine. Go back to Europe. Just go somewhere else, just not here. No matter what we do, we can't win. All sides seem to hate us. Just because it may manifest itself differently does not mean that the hate isn't there. As Horowitz writes, I had assumed anti-Semitism was a form of prejudice that caused people to look down on Jews as inferior and thus oppress them. But this power, depravity, conspiracy trope was something different. The idea is that Jews are inferior, but also somehow superior, smarter and more cunning, wealthier and more professionally successful, qualities they use to harm others. Anti-Semitic acts are therefore self-defense, a morally justified kind of punching up, which, by the way, are the views that have been adopted by some in the Muslim world as well, and not just by extremist groups like Hamas, but also Iran, the Houthis, and others. True, there are many who reject this radical thinking, and yet there are also many who embrace it. And more than that, as described by the preeminent scholar in anti-Semitism, Dr. Deborah Lipstadt, who tells us anti-Semitism is the world's oldest conspiracy theory. Because we are separate and distinct, we can also be blamed for all the world's ills, including the greatest moral failure of the world today, the state of Israel. The only way to solve this is through the eradication of the Jewish state. This belief has led to the rise in popularity of anti-Zionism. In terms of anti-Zionism, I personally thought for the longest time that this was a recent phenomenon. However, in my study, I've learned the very notion of anti-Zionism actually dates back to the 50s in the former Soviet Union. As Horowitz writes, in the wake of World War II, as the Soviets spread communism through Eastern Europe, they worked to expand their influence in the Middle East as well. Communist Czechoslovakia even provided desperately needed weapons to Israel that helped it prevail in 1948. But when this new state of Israel didn't align itself with Moscow, Stalin stepped up the persecution of Soviet Jews, arresting them, prosecuting them in show trials, and even executing them. The Soviets were adamant that they had nothing against the Jews. Attacking Jews is what the Nazis did. And the Nazis had been Soviets' archenemy. Rather, the Soviets' problem was with the Zionists. The Soviets insisted they were not anti-Semitic, they were simply anti-Zionist. The Soviets associated Zionism with imperialism, colonialism, and worst of all, Nazism. The result, as scholar Isabella Tabarovsky concludes, was a devastating rebrand of the Zionism from a movement of national self-determination to a racist, fascist, Nazi-like genocidal, imperial, colonialist, militarist, and apartheid-promoting conspiratorial ideology. Zionism had been turned into a story about a people who epitomize the worst evils of humankind, all of which are embodied in their state, the very founding of which was a sin. Sound familiar? Just a friendly reminder that the many of the oft-repeated tropes we hear on campuses and social media were created and fostered by one of the most repressive regimes in modern history. Or the Soviets may have understood it, what stood in their way of conquering the world, to their way of thinking, the Zionists. But really what they meant were the Jews. And one last depressing point, as Hurwitz notes, but there is just one thing stopping this utopian project from succeeding: the Jews. Sadly, this is part of a long, tragic history of hate. As examples abound throughout history, we early Christians are engaged in the grand moral project of Christianizing the Roman Empire, but those Jews refuse to convert. We communists are working to bring about a brotherhood of man, but those capitalist Jews are stymieing the revolution. We Germans are trying to create a glorious Aryan nation, but those race-polluting Jews are out to destroy us. We patriotic Americans are trying to preserve our country's heritage as a white Christian nation, but those globalist Jews are replacing white people with black and brown immigrants. We, those who care about social justice, are trying to rid the world of racism and colonialism, but those Zionists insist on maintaining their racist colonialist country. If we could just defeat those Jews, those Zionists, then we could finally create the world as it should be. In other words, as the journalist Haviv Redigur explains, this kind of anti-Semitism is not just about prejudice against or hatred of Jews. Rather, it's the belief that the Jews stand in the way of the redemption of the world. Now, to be clear, my friends, there are very valid criticisms of the ongoing war between Israel and Gaza, which even many Israelis are engaged in. And I fully support your concerns, criticisms, anguish, pain, and hurt about the violence and the ongoing violence and the needless suffering. At the same time, this is also a regional conflict, which, believe it or not, is not our fault, even as our hearts break. However, we cannot give in to the Hanukkah anti-Semitism tropes that turn us against each other. Instead, this evil, pernicious lie that Jews are responsible for all the evils in the world must be called out and condemned, not elevated and celebrated. This is only part of the struggle. Just as importantly, if not more so, we must also reclaim our heritage and stop letting others define it for us. As I've spoken about before, Judaism is not merely a religion, though it certainly has elements of it. Though we have been accused of being an ethnicity, the truth is we cover all colors and all ethnicities across the spectrum. As an aside, the majority of Jews living in Israel today can trace their lineage back not to Europe, but to North Africa and the Middle East. We may be many things, but we are certainly not exclusively white or white passing. We, in truth, are a multitude of colors and ethnicities. And more than that, though, we are a people based in a shared language of study and prayer. We have customs and foods, shared holidays, shared sacred texts, shared disagreements, as Rabbi Berzin was speaking about last night. We are more than just a culture or a series of practices. And we are by no means a dogmatic people. We are what I like to call a family in all of its messiness. Or as Israeli author Amos Oz and historian Fania Oz Salzberger explained, ours is not a bloodline, but a text line. As Hurwitz goes on to explain, our texts are the one thing that Jews have carried with us throughout our journey, with each generation adding its own pages. These words, I think, are our shared DNA, being part of that story and continuing to tell it. That, I think, is what makes us Jews. It is time for us to stop feeling shame about our Jewishness or hiding it. Instead, we can turn to the advice from Barry Weiss at the end of her book, How to Fight Anti-Semitism. Now, I'm not going to go through all of her points, but I will mention a few. First and foremost, we have to recommit to building our community. As she writes, just as almost nothing in Judaism can be done alone, 10 people are needed to make a minyan to pray. Nothing in life can be done alone. The work of fighting anti-Semitism requires a band of Maccabees. So, find yourself that band. If one doesn't already exist, build it. Other suggestions Weiss gives include lean into your Judaism and nurture your Jewish identity. This means read and study. This means embrace all the weird and sometimes uncomfortable elements of our heritage. It's not just about being a Jew in synagogue, though we're very glad you are here. It is also about being a Jew in your home and using Judaism to help guide how you live in the rest of the world as well. Our tradition has a lot to say about a lot of things. It was never intended to be compartmentalized to make others feel comfortable. It is meant to be lived loudly, openly, and proudly. Do things that will elevate your Jewish lives. Find new ways to celebrate Shabbat. Read a Jewish book. Learn more about Jewish ethics. Engage in acts of social justice, but study the Jewish values that undergird those endeavors. Embrace all of Judaism, from the cultural to the religious and everything in between. Don't pigeonhole yourself into being one type of Jew. The beauty of Judaism is that it is expansive in its exclusivity. It is meant to be lived and breathed. It is meant to be vibrant and dynamic and relevant. It is meant to be wrestled with and argued with over and over, like we do every year, like with the Akedah. Find ways to be proud of your Jewishness, for that is how we take back these narratives as our own. And when you do this, be sure to tell your story. As Weiss writes, the proper and ultimately the only response to this moment is to practice a Judaism of affirmation, not a Judaism of defensiveness. We should be telling our epic story, especially to the younger generation. We should not dumb it down. Or as I heard Dr. Lipstadt once say, we need to live with the joy of Judaism, not the oi of Judaism. As Weiss concludes in her book, there are many forces in our world insisting again that all Jews must die. But there is a force far, far greater than that, and that is the force of who we are. We are people descended from slaves who brought the world ideas that changed the course of history. One God, human dignity, the sanctity of life, freedom itself, that is our inheritance. That is our legacy. We are the people commanded to bring light into this world. Yes, being Jewish can be and often is a heavy burden. This is a legacy we have inherited. It is a legacy of despair and exaltation. It is a legacy of frustration and, yes, a legacy of hope. Yes, we are products of our history, and even more so the products of the histories that others have thrust upon us. But we also represent the potentiality of our futures. Despair and hate have always been a part of the Jewish journey. But what we cannot do, what we must not do, is let that define us. Nor can we or should we use that to define ourselves. How we embody and live our sacred heritage is strictly up to us, not to others. And to give the last words to Sarah Hurwitz today, we should, nay, we must, live proudly, gratefully, and joyfully as a Jew. Shana Tova.